Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hilary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with KAREN Weintraub and MICHAEL Kuchta, presenting their book, Born in Cambridge, 400 Years of Ideas and Innovators. Thank you for joining us tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account and live in our store. As always, our events schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Born in Cambridge on harvard.com. Your purchases make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in other virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. KAREN Weintraub is an author and journalist and a health reporter at USA Today. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Scientific American, and Stat, and she's the co-author of Autism Revolution and Fast Minds. MICHAEL Kuchta is an architect and campus planner and a senior urban design planner at Harvard. Tonight, KAREN and MICHAEL will be discussing their book, Born in Cambridge, 400 Years of Ideas and Innovators, which the Boston Globe called a celebration of the People's Republic and the energy, innovation, and creative crackle that's wildly out of proportion with the town's small size. We're so happy to have them both here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, KAREN and MICHAEL.
Thank you so much, Hilary. And thanks everybody for coming, and Harvard Bookstore for hosting us tonight, and MIT Press for publishing us. We are really excited to share this book, which has been a labor of love for us for more than 7 years. And I'm going to start by reading some of the book's preface, which lays out our reasons for writing it, its conceit and structure. Then Mike will talk about one of our favorite spots in the city, a place that encapsulates so much of Cambridge's innovative history and its potential. And then we'll each talk about one of our favorite characters from the book. We had so many, it was hard to choose. But these are people we didn't know about before we started this project. And yeah, we've fallen in love with most of the stories we tell, but thought these would give you at least a flavor of the range and breadth of what's happened in Cambridge over 4 centuries. So here goes. Here's the preface. We've now lived in Cambridge for more than 20 years, taking long walks and carting our daughters through the city's neighborhoods. Over the years, reading historical plaques and talking to our neighbors, we began keeping a mental list of firsts that happened here. The first college in the English colonies, the first mustering of the US Army, the first garden cemetery, the first two-way long-distance phone call, the first legal same-sex marriage. Our adopted city has also been home, at least for key points in their lives, to television chef Julia Child, civil rights leader and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, photography pioneer Edwin Land, and poet Robert Lowell. We have short stories about each of these in the book. As we expanded our list of innovative Cambridge people and ideas, we knew we'd need to make some hard choices. There are hundreds of Nobel Prize winners connected just to Harvard and MIT, for instance. We realized we couldn't write individual profiles of everybody, nor could we write in a compelling way about all of the prominent authors, political figures, and other celebrated Americans who have passed briefly through Cambridge. So we decided we had to limit our list, if only to preserve our own sanity, to fewer than 50 subjects. To do this, we established some fairly tight constraints. Each topic had to be an innovation that we could credibly argue had important beginnings in the city of Cambridge. We've laid claim to the development of microwave radar, for instance, but not the microwave oven. Many of the discoveries made here have advanced specialized fields. As generalists, though, we wanted to focus on developments that the average person has heard of. So we included the yellow highlighting marker and baking powder while leaving out sociable robots. We chose to include people, ideas, and technologies whose reputations have been solidly established, rather than more recent advances that are incredibly promising, but not yet fully realized. And we looked for stories that would engage readers in the complex personalities and processes of discovery that long made Cambridge an interesting place. Many of these advances are connected to Harvard and MIT, of course, but one of the things that surprised us was the number of important innovations that occurred in Cambridge outside of academia. So what we ended up with is not a conventional history of a city. We've tried to view Cambridge through its innovators rather than its political or community leaders. It's deliberately episodic. We haven't written much about the 18th century, for instance, when Cambridge had a tiny population and a limited influence on the world. Although we understand that Cambridge has been enriched through its history by waves of immigration, we've not focused specifically on the city's cultural history. Some of our subjects were visionaries, most were exceptionally passionate, and a few were seriously misguided. Some have become household names, while others are virtually unknown today. The common thread is that we found all of them interesting and worthy of exploration. And one thing that struck us again and again in working on this book is how the story of Cambridge reflects the history of America. It was one of the earliest communities settled by English colonists in the 1600s. When the country was divided over slavery in the mid-1800s, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was holding long conversations with abolitionists in his Cambridge living room. When World War II threatened, the city's scientists, engineers, and factory workers mobilized to develop important technologies like radar, and they made candy for the nation's soldiers and sailors, while many families sent their children off to fight. Other major events and trends that affected our nation also left fingerprints here. And for each of the subjects we chose to explore, we pored over biographies, journal articles, and archival records. We interviewed people who could bring the stories to life or add a modern day perspective. And we sought out visual materials that would connect our stories to the places where they happened. As our list of topics grew and morphed, some general categories emerged: literature, social reform, industry, basic science, national defense, the digital world, biotechnology, and popular culture. So we wrote about vaccine innovator Benjamin Waterhouse and 19th century feminist and journalist Margaret Fuller, pioneering educator Mariah Baldwin, as well as the origins of the first sewing machine, the Fig Newton, the electronic spreadsheet, and napalm. And of course, the Car Talk Guys and the movie Love Story. As our list of stories began to grow, it raised larger questions for us. How has this city of never more than 125,000 people been the scene of so much innovation? And how has it managed to thrive and reinvent itself while so many other American cities have struggled to stay afloat? This book represents our attempt at answers. Now Mike's going to talk about 700 Main Street, a nondescript building that illustrates some of the things we find compelling about Cambridge.
Thank you, Karen. If you'll share your screen.
I'm about to.
Great, thanks. So this is, hold on, an image of a factory that once existed on Main Street, about halfway between Kendall and Central Squares. The building here was built around 1842 for a company called the Davenport and Bridges Company. That was the leading railroad car manufacturer in the US at the time. And invented the center aisle rail car, the idea that you put seats on both sides of an aisle the way that, say, an Amtrak train does. And that was really the first innovation that happened on this particular site on Main Street back in the 1840s. If you look at the image, you can see that the Charles River was then very, very close by. Now it's sort of many blocks away from the river's edge, with much of the MIT campus in the space in between, the land for which was really created in the latter half of the 19th century. So the story about this site is in the 1850s, the Davenport Company sold the factory to another company that rented it to another company called the Walworth Company. Walworth manufactured steam heating systems on the site, and it happened to employ a man named Daniel Stilson, who had served as a mechanic on a Navy ship in the Civil War. In 1869, Stilson invented the adjustable pipe wrench, which came to be known as the Stilson wrench. I have a small example here. The Stilson wrench vastly improved the ability of plumbers to tighten pipes with one hand. It had a unique ratcheting design that proved very popular with plumbers. Stilson received a patent for the design, which he then licensed to his employer, the Walworth Company, which in turn manufactured pipe wrenches for many decades. And it really became the standard wrench that any plumber would have. The Walworth plant, though, has another role to play in another completely different innovation, which is the first long distance phone call. So you may have heard of Alexander Graham Bell, who was a Boston University speech teacher and amateur inventor. Bell had been working on the design of the telephone at his Boston laboratory. And of course, the famous story is the conversation Bell had with his assistant, Mr. Watson, come here, I want you. Now, at that time, they were both located in the same building. But to be really useful, the telephone has to work over long distances. So for Bell to test whether it was really going to work, they used an existing telegraph line that connected the Walworth Company's Boston headquarters to its Cambridge manufacturing plant. Watson was positioned at the Cambridge end of the wire, and both he and Bell took notes on the words that they said and the words that they heard, and they later compared notes. So this building, this site on 700 Main Street, was the site of the first real demonstration of the usefulness of the telephone, which has obviously revolutionized communications globally. But wait, there's more, as they say in the infomercials. In 1882, the Walworth building was torn down, and the building we now see on the site was built. For a while, it was a home to a furniture manufacturer, but that company leased some of its space to a man named Edwin Land in 1940. Land used the space as a laboratory for his experiments in light polarization, which is a technology that helps reduce glare in things like sunglasses and photographic lenses. And it's in this building that Edwin Land invented the Polaroid camera and the field of instant photography. The famous story is that in 1943, Land was on vacation in Santa Fe, New Mexico, taking family photographs when his 3-year-old daughter asked, "Why can't I see the photo now?" That got his brain working, and he methodically went through the steps that would be required to make an instant camera system. So a short 5 years later, on Thanksgiving, and in 1948, his Polaroid company introduced the camera and film system at the Jordan Marsh department store in downtown Boston. And it really became the consumer product sensation of the year. Jordan Marsh sold out of its camera supply that same day. Each camera was like $89 a piece, which was a lot of money in those days. The Land's camera was sort of the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, all sort of wrapped up into one. In the post-World War II era, increasingly prosperous Americans who had money to spend spent it on things like the Polaroid camera. And a dozen years later, Polaroid sales reached $100 million a year, a pretty substantial benchmark. Polaroid expanded its footprint and hiring in Cambridge really at the same time in the 1960s and 1970s, when the city itself was really losing a lot of industry. At a time when people were concerned that Cambridge, which had really been a major industrial center in the Boston area, had no future. And Polaroid was a bright spot in the local economy and really helped things to sort of keep going. So the first black and white cameras invented on the site were followed by color cameras. And then in the 1970s, the company's sales grew even more with the SX70 camera, which maybe if you're older, you might remember. The success of all these systems, however, couldn't continue indefinitely. And in 1980, Edwin Land stepped down as chief executive. The company faced competition from 1-hour photo processing and then later from digital photography. And really what happened was it bet the farm on an instant movie camera in the late 1970s that was a real failure. Finally, in 2001, Polaroid filed for its first bankruptcy and largely sort of left Cambridge behind, although it still exists. So that might have been the end for these buildings on Main Street and the city's workforce, and maybe even the city's future. But as luck would have it, MIT bought the building and renovated it in the early 2000s. And in 2013, a group called Lab Central took over the building. Lab Central is a biotechnology incubator supported by the state government, by MIT, and by some philanthropic funding. And it serves to help small entrepreneurs who want to start companies in the biotechnology field. They offer not only office space and administrative support, but the lab equipment that would be very expensive for these companies to purchase, things like PCR machines or sequencers. So this building now has a new life, and Lab Central has expanded beyond its initial footprint. And we think, maybe this site will generate sort of the next generation of innovations, sort of the next generation of the pipe wrench or the Polaroid camera that will help sort of Cambridge be sort of economically vibrant into the future. We don't know, but this building and site represent sort of this idea of constant reinvention. So in one single place, things that have had regional, national, or even global impacts happened. Everyone across the world has used a telephone. Every plumber has one of these wrenches. We've all heard of the Polaroid camera, and it all happened right in this one spot in Cambridge. I think that's a really remarkable thing, and it doesn't really happen anywhere else that I know of. If you go by the building, there are a couple of plaques on it, but probably people pass by this building, day in and day out without really ever noticing sort of the rich history and its role in changing the world. Now, Karen is going to talk about a person who contributed to Cambridge's life in a completely different way.
Thanks. So we start the book talking about poet Anne Bradstreet. And Anne was the first published poet in the British colonies. She wrote her first poem here in Cambridge in 1632, when she was only 19 years old, about where the Harvard Coop is now. She and her husband, Simon Bradstreet, were among the first residents of Cambridge, then called Newtown, which was founded by her father, Thomas Dudley, one of the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and its second governor. She wrote the poem after surviving an illness that she feared would kill her. It was the second time she'd already at 19 survived a second life-threatening illness. She'd had smallpox back in England, where she grew up. Back there, her father was a very devout, very active Puritan. And the government and state religion in England at the time were very deeply interconnected. And Puritans felt like it was the religion and government went too far and were too colorful and focused too much on lights and music and distracted from the individual forming a relationship with God. And they wanted to strip bare this religion. So this got them interested in self-governance and education. And Dudley took this quite seriously. He educated his daughter Anne to both read and, more unusually, to write. She could write by age 10, which was not very typical at all of girls in those days. And the ministers, the Puritan ministers who they went to listen to every weekend, talked of a new Jerusalem, a new land where they might live and not be surrounded by these people they didn't agree with. And Dudley took these ministers literally and ended up bringing his wife and 5 children, including Anne and her husband Simon, who was his former apprentice, took them all to Massachusetts, and they landed in Salem in 1630. When they came to this new world, it was a terrifying place. Half the people on their boat died that first winter of starvation. Harvard honored Bradstreet by naming a gate after her. It opens onto the Science Center Plaza. The insignia was, "I came into this country where I found a new world and new manners at which my heart rose." And today we might hear "my heart rose" as, I was thrilled to be in this country, but actually in those days it meant she wanted to vomit. It was so awful. It was a terrible place. And so the fact that she was able to make time for poetry while raising children, she ended up having 8, I think, and running a household with her husband, who was often away on colonial business. He was later a governor as well. Was extremely brave. It took a lot of guts to do that in those days. The Bradstreets only lived in Cambridge for about 2 years. They moved to Ipswich and then Andover. And Anne's poetry was mostly lost and unread for centuries. In the early 20th century, she was included in an anthology. And then in the 60s, the poet Adrienne Rich, who also has Cambridge connections, kind of helped resurrect her reputation. Rich highlighted Bradstreet's, plain, unadorned style as the precursor of a truly American form of poetry, which we associate later with Whitman and Frost. Anne didn't write about Greek mythology, but about having survived a fit of sickness. And her work is still read at weddings today, so it's still relevant. And she also, we think, exemplifies some of the larger trends that we try to highlight in the book. Many of the people in our stories seem to have a higher purpose in mind. They innovated not just for their own sake, for their own ego, but to help others. And they were creative and innovative for the benefit of others. Anne led a life of the mind and pursued intellectual, creative interests. And in that way was like many other people we feature. So now Mike is going to talk about a different person we featured named Wallace Saban. Sorry, I'm gonna scroll down here. Okay.
All right. Okay. So in the early months of 1896, if you stood outside Harvard's Sanders Theater after the last lecture of the day, you might have noticed young men lugging red velvet seat cushions out of the building, across Cambridge Street, and then into the university's Fogg Museum. By dawn, the cushions would be back in their rightful place. Another night of scientific research completed. The cushions were used to solve a problem plaguing a lecture hall inside the Fogg building and would help lead to an entirely new field of science. The stately Fogg Museum building had been recently completed, designed by an eminent New York architect named Richard Morris Hunt. But students who slipped in to hear a lecture couldn't make out what their professor was saying. The acoustics in the new semicircular lecture hall were terrible. Harvard President Charles Eliot was so concerned that he personally approached a junior faculty member in the university's physics department for help. Colleagues told 27-year-old Wallace Saban to ignore the request. It was a fool's errand, essentially, is what they said. But Saban took up the challenge and set out to figure out why Sanders Theater was such a great lecture hall and the Fogg so unsatisfactory, though the two sat directly across the street from each other and had the same amphitheater-like shape. Saban set a system up to analyze the acoustical properties of the Fogg Hall. From the speaker's platform, which you can see in this image, he would briefly switch on a specially modified organ pipe. His research assistants, standing at various spots in the room, would take note of the sound's reverberation time, the amount of time that elapsed until they could no longer hear the tone. A sound emitted at the Fogg's podium, they learned, bounced around the room much longer than it did in Sanders Theater, explaining why it was so hard to understand. As Saban wrote at the time, a word spoken in an ordinary tone of voice was audible for 5.5 seconds afterwards. During this time, even a very deliberate speaker would have uttered 12 to 15 succeeding syllables. Thus, the successive enunciations blended into a loud sound, through which and above which it was necessary to hear and distinguish the orderly progression of the speech. Across the room, this could not be done. Even near the speaker, it could only be done with an effort wearisome in the extreme. So night after night, Saban and his research assistants borrowed seat cushions from Sanders Theater, running them over to the Fogg building to see how they changed the sound quality. They placed a few cushions into the lecture hall at a time, making acoustic measurements using the organ pipe, then adding more cushions and making new measurements. On many nights, Saban and his assistants worked until dawn, sleeping during the daytime. As a reason for his unconventional work hours, he later explained that Cambridge was quiet only after the streetcars had stopped running late at night and before the milk carts started rolling over the cobblestones in the morning. Meanwhile, President Eliot of Harvard became impatient with Saban's lack of rapid conclusions. But Saban was doing more than just fixing an isolated problem. He was inventing an entirely new field of physics. With all of the Sanders cushions crowding the Fogg auditorium, Saban calculated that he could reduce the reverberation time of the room from 5.5 seconds to just over a second, making speech much more intelligible. Finally, in September 1898, nearly 3 years after he first started investigating the problem, Saban was able to guide Harvard in installing blankets of felt in this lecture hall and covering the speaker's platform with carpet. Though it was an improved situation, the building was never really an acoustic success, and eventually the building was demolished in the early 1970s to make way for an undergraduate dorm, Canada Hall. Saban's work at the Fogg was only the beginning of his career in acoustics, however. Harvard's President Eliot next asked Saban to advise the architects of a performance hall being planned for the Boston Symphony Orchestra. At that point, Saban had lots of raw data, but no formulas he could use to analyze the design of an unbuilt room. He spent several weeks feverishly calculating, trying to derive a mathematical equation for determining reverberation times. Finally, on Saturday night, October 29th, 1898, the answer came to him. His mother wrote in her diary, his face lighted with gratified satisfaction as he announced quietly, "I have found it at last." The next day, Saban wrote to Eliot, accepting the Boston Symphony assignment. Saban devoted nearly 2 years to refine the symphony hall's design. He recommended eliminating balconies at the side of the stage and placing the heating system under the floor to limit noise. Boston Symphony's Hall opened in 1900 to significant acclaim and has maintained a reputation as one of the most acoustically refined venues ever built for orchestral music. Saban discovered that the acoustics of a symphony hall need to be different from those of a lecture hall or a chamber music venue. For a time, nobody else in the United States or really in the world knew as much about building acoustics as Saban, and he received commissions across the United States. In fact, in 1915, the Remington Typewriter Company of New York asked him to help it produce quieter typewriters. He also consulted for the US House of Representatives and state houses across the country. As a measure of Saban's importance to the field of acoustics, a unit of sound absorption, the Saban, was named for him, and the Acoustical Society of America still has an award in his honor. Saban applied the scientific method to the field of acoustics. He was really the first person to do that. Previously, it had been really more of an art than a science. And in Cambridge, there's still a consulting firm that specializes in architectural acoustics. Engineers at a company called Ascentec keep an original Sanders Theater cushion in a plexiglass case as a relic. Displayed on a bookshelf, the red velvet is dirty and worn, and the blue and white ticking on the back is threadbare. But to Ascentec, the cushion remains an important reminder of the founding of their field. So that's sort of the end of our sort of formal presentation. I will say one of the things that really has been fun about this process of researching and writing the book is all the different people we've met and all the places throughout Cambridge that we've gotten to explore that we probably wouldn't have known about otherwise. So for instance, the folks who keep a cushion in their offices were as excited to talk about Wallace Saban and the origins of architectural acoustics as you could imagine anyone ever being. So we had dozens of these conversations with people who were passionate about their fields or what they know or what they research, and that really helped us to know Cambridge better than we ever did in the past.
We have one question so far. Please put your questions in the Q&A. When out-of-towners come to visit, what Cambridge spot do you take them to show off the town? Mike, you want to take that one?
Well, I probably don't take them to 700 Main Street as their first stop, although, I'm enough of a sort of innovation geek that I suppose I would include that on the tour. I mean, Harvard Square is obviously, maybe not obviously, where the city started. And it's sort of remarkable that it's still in many ways the heart of the city. So I guess I would probably start at the Harvard Square Red Line and really go in any direction from there.
Someone wants to know if we have plans for a walking tour of Cambridge. Mike's great at walking backwards, by the way.
We are in the process of working on a walking tour with History Cambridge, which used to be called the Cambridge Historical Society, and does an amazing job of kind of making the history of Cambridge accessible, and they have lots of great events. So we're working on that maybe in the fall. So stay tuned on that.
And I'm going to take this one. Which overlooked Cambridge figure do you encounter do you think deserves their own biography? You can add to this, Mike, too, obviously. But so among the many people I fell in love with this was a guy named John Bartlett. If you're of a certain age, you might remember Bartlett's Quotations. It was a book of famous people's quotations well before we had the internet. And Bartlett ran a bookstore in Harvard Square and was the internet of the day. People would run across the street from Harvard and say, who said this? Do you know, where can I find this? And he had a prodigious memory, and he had read most of the books in his bookstore, and he was able to give them answers. And after a while, they said, why don't you write all of this down, put it in a book yourself? And in 1855, he published the first edition of his Bartlett's Familiar Quotations. It is now in its 18th edition, still around. It is online now, But I think he's a pretty cool guy, and I would love to see more about him myself. Mike, do you have
I was going to say,
anything?
yeah, let me just add to that. One of the things that we found in doing this research is how many important people or undiscovered people or people we hadn't known about previously already have, great biographies written about them. So we, in some cases, met or talked to the authors of people who were experts in, subjects that we were really, as generalists, only able to sort of touch, the sort of surface level of doing biographical research. So we are really indebted to a lot of authors and researchers who have done a lot of the legwork to bring some of these people to light. I will say, though, I guess my pick would be Elias Howe. So Elias Howe invented the sewing machine in Cambridge. You may not have ever heard of him. I had never heard of him. This happened basically in the 1840s when Howe began experimenting with designs for a sewing machine, and he made a wooden model. He actually got the first US patent for a sewing machine, but because he didn't have a lot of money, he wasn't really able to commercialize it that quickly. He ended up going to London for a year, and then by the time he came back, people like Isaac Singer, who you may have heard of and associate with the sewing machine, had sort of stolen or infringed upon his patent. So Elias Howe ended up being engaged in patent disputes and legal disputes for many years. But at the end of it, he was able to get $5 for each sewing machine made over a period of, I think, the first 5 years. And then he got like $1 per sewing machine after that. He ended up opening a factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut, not in Cambridge, and died in the New York area, a very wealthy man. But he really did invent the sewing machine in Cambridge. And there isn't a plaque that I know of anywhere in the city that indicates that. And I think, that's something that's pretty cool.
It's nice to see so many familiar names in the Q&A. Thanks, guys. We have an anonymous attendee who asks, what most surprised you in your research?
Let's see, am I supposed to answer that?
Yeah.
I guess starting out, we knew that, Cambridge, Massachusetts has a reputation as sort of the US capital of higher education or whatever, right? But as Karen mentioned in our intro, how many of the amazing things that have happened here happened outside of the academic sphere. Again, the example that I came up with, Elias Howe, yes, the yellow highlighter marker was invented here. And because Cambridge has had this incredible industrial past, which is really only evident really in some of the buildings that were left behind today. So, there's one candy factory left in Cambridge that manufactures junior mints, manufactures the world's supply of junior mints. But it's really one of the very few companies that's still operating an industrial, enterprise in Cambridge, when brickmaking was enormously important to the city between 1840 and 1940 in North Cambridge. And, there were all of these sort of other industries that really had a lot of impact on the city and in some cases on innovating new things.
Yeah, I was going to say just the breadth and the depth is amazing to me, from literary figures to social reformers to biotech, is just sort of amazing in a town this small. Next question. What were you most surprised about in our research? I guess it's the same. Questions are moving. Some of the innovators, were seriously misguided. Can you tell us more? Sure, Phil. The first one who comes to mind is Louis Agassiz, who was in a sense America's first public scientist. He's Swiss, and he was responsible for discovering making advances in glaciology and glaciers, understanding ice ages. And he came to the United States and became a big man in what was then a pretty small pond, and became a public scientist and used his Harvard platform to speak to the public and to solicit ideas from the public. But he was also, and I should say his wife was a co-founder of Radcliffe, and they educated women in their home. We have other people in the book who were educated in their home. But Agassiz had some crazy ideas about evolution, or not ideas about evolution and about race. He did not believe in evolution. The Harvard Museum of Natural History, until about 15 years ago, was organized by Louis Agassiz, his collection originally, that it didn't acknowledge, in a sense, evolution. They put all the I'm not going to do a good job of articulating how that was, but he didn't accept the idea that God didn't put everything down on this earth in its current form. And then he also had some pretty awful ideas about race. So his name actually was taken off of the school in the neighborhood near, it will still call the Agassiz neighborhood, but the school is now the Mariah Baldwin School, after another person we feature in the book. Mike, anybody else you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we've also written about people who had ideas that didn't go as far as they had hoped. So for instance, we wrote about a woman named Melusina Fay Peirce, who invented the idea of cooperative housekeeping, which is essentially in the 1860s. She was attempting to make the lives of women and who had domestic duties easier, largely the sort of upper middle class women of Cambridge, by instituting a common laundry and store where the sort of groups of households could kind of pool their funds and have some of these domestic services provided for them. She started this cooperative housekeeping venture in Cambridge. It's on Arrow Street, or was on Arrow Street. And she wrote about this idea, which, now you think like, well, of course, there's a grocery store that I can get, prepared foods from. And of course, those things didn't exist. Her mother, Melusina Fay Peirce's mother, had died at a young age of tuberculosis. And Melusina always felt that if her mother's kind of domestic burdens hadn't been as intense as they were, that perhaps her mother's life would have been longer than it was. So she followed her husband to Europe. He was doing some research in Europe, and left this experiment in cooperative housekeeping to the sort of rest of the committee. And in her absence of, I don't know, in 9 months, they basically shut down the, it wasn't a sort of an economically viable concept for this group of families that had started it, which, seems she was just many, many decades sort of ahead of her time in her thinking. And so, was she misguided? I don't know if that's the right word I would use, but we wrote about people whose innovations didn't necessarily, transform all of the world in the time that they were living.
Yeah, well, one of the others, I guess, would be Louis Fieser and napalm, which he invented at the request of the US government during World War II. We tend to associate it with the Vietnam War because of the horrors of that we saw then, or still remember from then. But actually it was invented in World War II, and he meant to use it against buildings, to burn buildings down. It was an incendiary device. And he was horrified as well when it was used against civilians. So that wasn't his doing necessarily, but he wrote a letter to the U.S. government, complained about the use of his invention for those purposes. So misuse, maybe not misguided. Another question from a good friend. If you could go back in time to one decade in Cambridge, which decade would that be? When would you go back to?
So I guess if I'm going to answer that, to me, that's probably the 1880s. I feel like that's really when Cambridge exploded, both in terms of its population. You know, there was massive immigration in that period of time. And so I think, you know, the population of Cambridge, I'm not going to get this right, was like maybe 4,000 in 1800 and like 80,000 in 1900. Again, those are sort of very rough numbers. I probably don't have that right, but nonetheless, it's in this period of the 1880s and 1890s that's the city is really, that we see today, is sort of built out in that period of time because, you know, of the massive infusion of people, and a lot of new ideas are also generated in that time period. So that's my favorite.
I was going to go just a little bit later, maybe 1890, 1900. And in part, there are a couple of interesting figures here at the time in African-American history. Somebody asks in a later question about Mariah Baldwin. She was named principal of the Baldwin School in 1889, a post that she held for 33 years. And she had been born, she was literally born in Cambridge. Not everybody in this book was. And she grew up here and was educated here, could not originally find a job, went to Maryland and taught there for a while, then came back and was hired at this school now called the Baldwin School, taught every grade before she was named principal, and was a beloved teacher. And she also led this double life as a leader of the region's African-American community. And her parlor, her living room, which was about 2 blocks behind where I'm sitting now, was the center for Black intelligentsia. They gathered in her parlor on a regular basis. People like W.E.B. Du Bois, who we also mention in the book, who was the first Black to receive a PhD from Harvard, went on to found the field of sociology in America, and had a profound effect on civil rights 60 years later in this country. William Monroe Trotter, also like Du Bois, who was a co-founder of the Niagara movement, which became the NAACP. So there was a lot of ferment, a lot of activity here in those days. Another person, I'm not going to go into detail, but Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins, a writer, African-American woman who was the leading female African-American voice in America around the turn of the century. So there were just a lot of interesting people here at the time. The opposite of the out-of-town question, where do you recommend locals go that they may not know
about? Let me go think about that. Well, other than 700 Main Street, where there are a few plaques, one of the places we hadn't been for a long time while we lived here was the Longfellow House on Bradstreet, which, you know, I guess my impression of Longfellow's poetry was, you know, is sort of a pre-modern poet. In other words, his poetry is very rhyming. It deals with sort of stories about America that seem sort of a little at this point trite. But we really discovered a sort of what for us was sort of a new side of Longfellow, that in terms of his both interest in sort of multiculturalism, I guess would be the sort of current day word. He was a teacher of modern European languages. He was very, very good at learning modern European languages, and taught Spanish and French and other languages at Harvard. And in a way that I think of him as sort of the ultimate 19th century American. To me, he was sort of the Walt Disney of the 19th century, as famous really as any American, and certainly more famous than any poet you could probably name today. But that he really, in addition to sort of shaping sort of the American mythology about its past, was really a broad thinker on again, issues of culture. And I don't know, I just gained a new appreciation for him through this research in a way that I hadn't sort of previously.
We also, sticking to the theme of literature, we made for ourselves a little poetry walking tour mostly in the Brattle area, and focused on women poets. And we were struck by, there were plaques on houses for the male poets, but not for the female poets. So that was sort of both fun to see how close all these poets lived together, but also striking to see who was being recognized and who wasn't. So we might try to do something about that at some point. Next question. What do you think accounts for the tradition of innovation in Cambridge, if it doesn't all stem from academia? The water, I think, is the answer. Is there a rich public commons here? Were people aware it was such a hub of creativity at the time?
So I guess one way, Harvard Bookstore would like to answer this question live. Does that mean Harvard Bookstore?
No, just you're answering it.
Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry. We after sort of going through this process of researching and interviewing and sort of paring down our list, we sort of sat back and said, well, what have we learned? What have we learned in all of this about either the nature of innovation, the nature of urbanism? How is it that, Cambridge has gotten to kind of reinvent itself and over the course of 4 centuries? So we, came up with, I guess, some themes that we would maybe talk about if you want, Karen. So the first is obviously that education, is important both at the sort of individual level and at the community level, but also the urban density and the diversity of the city, we feel allows sort of ideas to flow in multiple and unexpected directions sometimes. So one example of this is we write about Julia Child, the French chef, right? And, she's got her start on television while she lived in Cambridge and, sort of built an empire in public television. She got her pots from a guy named Ben Thompson, who was an architect. Ben Thompson, another subject of our book, designed the Faneuil Hall Quincy Market renovation in the 1970s. They're sort of generically called festival marketplaces. And it was such a success in Boston that it, there were these things built around the country. So Ben Thompson was this sort of innovative architect who could kind of see possibilities in sort of decaying older cities, who was friends with Julia Child, who could see possibilities in, cooking on television. And so it's just these sort of happenstance interactions and relationships that form in a city that's, very walkable and dense and diverse. And I think that really is a piece of it.
Did they know? I wouldn't say that people knew that Cambridge was distinctive in terms of its creativity at the time in the 1890s or in World War II. I mean, people knew that there was a lot going on with the universities, but I don't think there was a sense of we're the great innovative town. At least I didn't come across anything. Next question from Holly, who complimented your walking backwards, your tour leading abilities, is who is the most recent innovator who made the book? I guess that would be mine. So the biotech industry is, as anybody who lives in Cambridge now knows, has taken off in the last 15, 20 years in Cambridge. And we talk a little bit about why that is. And some of the gene editing work that's going on here is really incredible and impressive. Obviously, it's not the only place in the world where this is happening, but a lot of the innovation in this field is happening here. And the potential is for curing inherited diseases, for instance, things like sickle cell, Huntington's, hopefully someday, horrible inherited diseases. And then hopefully after that, some more common diseases, things like heart disease. And researchers here have now figured out ways to edit in and out every kind of genetic mistake that's possible. So there's a lot of work going on there, and that's some of the most recent innovations. Oh, and I forgot to mention Moderna. Yes. So the COVID vaccine, one of the leading COVID vaccines was developed by Moderna, which is based down the street. yeah, and came out of decades of related research in the Cambridge area. So that would be two very recent innovations. Anything cool about Inman Square or the Latin, Cambridge Rindge and Latin? The first thing that comes to mind about Cambridge Rindge and Latin is that's where the car talk guys went to school. But Mike, Inman?
Inman, I mean, I guess so we live pretty close to Inman. I guess the closest thing that we wrote about was actually the house that Mariah Baldwin lived in, which is on Prospect Street, fairly close to Inman Square. And it's actually considered by the National Park Service to be a National Historic Landmark, which is the most sort of highest honor that the Park Service designates, buildings like Memorial Hall at Harvard or the Capitol Building in Washington, D.C. are all National Historic Landmarks. And Mariah Baldwin's house, unfortunately, is not in a great state of repair right now. It's hard to tell if it's occupied, but it's sort of this enigma to us because we have so many questions about Mariah Baldwin and her ideas and
there are no plaques.
And there are no plaques, and we really wish that we could sort of understand that better. What else?
Anything else in Inman or Latin? I mean, other famous people went to Boston. Rindge and
Latin.
Ben Affleck.
Yeah, Matt Damon.
So we didn't write about him much, only in passing. What was our method of deciding who to include? As I sort of mentioned in the preface, we wanted people who had a larger influence. So not just within the field of biochemistry, but people who had, inventions that were part of our everyday lives, like the highlighter. We also wanted to make sure that the invention happened here, or the innovative thing happened here. And we stretched things a little bit in a few cases. There were a lot of famous people who lived here. Margaret and H.A. Ray lived here, the developer or the authors of the Curious George books. And we didn't include them because they wrote most of the books before they moved here. So we made decisions like that in who to keep in and who to keep out. And then at the end, after our first very long draft, we had to trim a little bit. And so we cut a few people who didn't fit our larger themes. So for instance, we'd had Paul Samuelson, the Nobel Prize winning economist, and we probably should have found a way to wedge him in, but we were looking for a way to cut anyway. And so we cut reference to economics. And a lot of this was just us. We take full blame for this. It was a subjective process, and we just told what we hoped. We limited it to what we hoped could be good stories.
Yeah, I was going to say we really focused on the storytelling, and when we felt like we made drafts of certain subjects and just didn't feel like we were able to add sort of something new to the story or tell it in a compelling and new way, and so that was sort of a factor for us in deciding sort of what made the final cut.
So that's why we don't have Facebook, for instance, because everybody knows the story of its founding in the Harvard dorm room, and we just didn't feel like we could add much there, and that its story is not fully told yet. So we didn't want to jump the gun on that one. Did you address the significance of the Charles River in the development of Cambridge?
I would say we haven't addressed it sort of head on. I mean, there's a great book, I think also by MIT Press, by Carl Haglund, called Inventing the Charles River, which talks extensively about, the Charles River really is this sort of man-made creation, the Charles River Reservation, the Charles River Basin. It was originally a tidal estuary, and then once the Charles River Dam was created in 1910, it became sort of a regularized body, that didn't that go up and down every day with the tides, and that actually was pretty influential in some of the property development on its edges. But we didn't end up talking a lot about that issue. And I agree that it's a really fascinating story of the river itself.
And things like, as you mentioned earlier, MIT was built on land that wouldn't have been there but for the damming of the river.
Right.
So it certainly had a profound effect. Sue wants to know more about which women poets we were referring to on our walking tour. So Elizabeth Bishop, who lived pretty much right in Harvard Square near Burdick's. In the Arms, what's it called? The something Arms.
The Brattle Arms.
Brattle Arms, thank you.
Yep.
And Adrian Rich lived on Brattle Street. May Sarton was around there. I forget where Louise Gluck lives, but somewhere
Yeah. Good.
in there. And there were so many poets in Cambridge that we ended up just almost just listing them because we couldn't go into much detail, and neither of us is an expert in the subject. But T.S. Eliot lived here. E.E. Cummings was born and raised here and was a big fan of Mariah Baldwin, the principal of his school. Robert Frost lived here for decades. Stanley Kunitz went to Harvard and stayed for a while. Sorry, I'm reading this now because I haven't committed every page to memory. Seamus Haney also lived here for a long time, taught at Harvard. Frank Bidart, who is a Pulitzer, thank you. Pulitzer winning poet who's taught at Wellesley College for decades and has lived in Cambridge for all that time as well. So lots and lots of famous poets have spent key time in Cambridge. And yeah, that's something I would love to learn more about as we maybe for the next edition of the book. And we're open to suggestions if there are people you think we missed out on. Mike, were you gonna add something there?
Yeah, no, just we're coming up on the end of our
Right.
of our hour, and just to say, we feel like this was sort of the start of a conversation. There are probably lots of people who have done amazing things that we've never heard of. So, we hope that people will sort of feed us names and ideas. Not that having spent 7 years writing this one book that we're ready.
Ever going to do this again?
Right, but who knows? Maybe there'll be a revised edition in another decade, let's say. We love to sort of hear stories about all the creative people and innovative people in this place we call home.
Anyway, hope you get as much pleasure out of this book as we have been writing it. Hillary, over to you.
Yes. Thank you both so much. This was so lovely. So thank you to Karen and Mike. Thanks to everybody out there for spending your evening with us.
Thanks, everybody.
Genuinely. Please, you can learn more about this book and purchase Born in Cambridge on harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and please, everybody, stay well. Thank you both.
Thank you.